Hi everyone, Joe March here with the Grand Infinity, and today I'm talking with Ruben, also known as Force Mysticism. But before we get into our chat, I'd like to give Ruben a moment to talk a little bit about himself. Hi, Ruben.
Oh, hi. So I run the channel Force Mysticism, and essentially what it is basically a series of audio essays that I put together, kind of like how people keep a grimoire,
Hmm.
but I mean, mostly it's for my own sake. Um, and lately I've actually been getting a lot more subscribers than I thought I would get.
Hmm.
So that's kind of neat. But basically, I follow Jediism as a religion.
Right.
Yeah, and my approach is kind of less of a new agey one than some Jedi might have,
Hmm.
but it's also more esoteric. I lean more towards like an esoteric Buddhism type approach to my practice.
Right.
Um, So, basically, what I have on the channel right now is a couple of meditations and a
Hmm.
couple of philosophy videos. And I do have a bachelor's degree in philosophy.
Hmm.
So, that was kind of fun. I felt like a Lovecraft character. Yeah. And I joined the Temple of the Jedi Order
Hmm.
as a religious group, and right now I'm ranked there as a senior knight. Um,
Hmm.
for whatever that's worth. I know
Yeah, let's
that's
actually let's actually get into that a little because I think some of my viewers probably aren't familiar with Jediism. They're probably thinking like, wait, like Star Wars, which is true, but I'll let you explain.
yeah. So it is Star Wars. We don't usually take the stance that the movies are divine prophecy or
Hmm.
anything like that. It's more that the Force itself is, I mean, George Lucas created it for the intention of spreading religious ideas
Hmm.
and asking religious questions. And it kind of represents a lot of God's images, impersonal gods,
Hmm.
as opposed to personal deities.
Right.
Um, which a lot of contemporary religions don't focus on as much. And I don't know, I guess it leaves a lot of people who do want to entertain those ideas kind of starved because they're looking around and it's not like you can find a local guru who's mastered Vedanta.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So we use the Star Wars symbolism because it's effective. Like
Right.
when I say the Force, you know what I mean. And like as a Jedi, because there are people who believe in the Force who aren't Jedi,
Hmm.
but as a Jedi myself, I kind of see that knightly samurai kind of
Hmm.
chivalrous archetype.
Right.
Uh,
As a model
also,
for how to live, sort of.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that it really lends itself not only to like my religious or occult or mystic practice, but to how I guide my actions through my life.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I don't remember how many years ago it was that I first heard of the idea of Jediism, and at first I was like, what? People are just like believing in the Star Wars stuff, and then everyone that I've ever talked to who's involved in it or listened to their videos, like you yourself included, it's been like talking to someone who has a ton of knowledge on Eastern mysticism, but just chooses not to go into the deep Eastern mysticism ideals in order to reach kind of a Western audience. At least that's how it's always seemed to me.
Well, yeah, I think that's accurate. Actually, at the temple, there's a digital library there,
Hmm.
and honestly, a lot of people focus on like the Suzuki or the Alan Watts even
Yeah,
is
I
very
love him.
popular. Yeah, and he's really fun to listen to.
Hmm.
But yeah, kind of, I don't want to say appropriating because ideas are just ideas. They can't really be,
Right, that's true.
yeah, but kind of presenting it in a way that most people in a modern setting would understand. Like, it's really difficult to talk about certain aspects of someone when you're talking about some Buddha who has a
Yeah.
name that's 20 letters long. But if I say Obi-Wan Kenobi,
Hmm.
then most people who I talk to know what I'm talking
It's
about.
it's almost like a modern day mythology.
Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to the more personal deity stuff, I I do see it having that kind of potential, maybe among like chaos magicians,
Hmm.
where I mean, I even personally, when I do my whole like guru yoga kind of invocation type thing, I'm looking for Yoda, right? Because that's kind of what
Right.
I
Yeah.
envision as like a mystic figure. Um,
Yeah. And we've talked a bit on this channel before about the concept of masks, of like energy or entities coming to you, but having sort of a mask that they'll put on that is a bridge between them and your subconscious mind. It's a theory. I don't know if it's actually how it works, but it's something that I've been finding more and more seems more and more accurate to me to describe it. And in that case, it would almost seem more like you find the archetype that works for you to bring that entity across. So in your case, if you're looking for a wise entity who's going to teach you ways about this Eastern mysticism, he may show himself as Yoda because that is the archetype in your mind.
oh yeah, absolutely. And I think by recognizing that it is kind of silly,
Hmm.
like, I'm envisioning Yoda and trying to be one with Yoda, right? And that's kind of silly, but by recognizing that and really just focusing on it, like, okay, this is something that I'm using as a tool to call that kind of thing out.
Hmm.
I feel like that's lent a lot to my practice. I
Yeah,
mean, it makes the meditation sessions shorter.
I actually think it might help with keeping you from having a high ego too. I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that when we can take some of our practice with a grain of salt, at least in my experience, when you can be like, okay, this experience just happened, but it was kind of silly, it helps to keep you from being like, I'm some archmagus who's calling upon forces beyond people's comprehension. It's like, no, 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 no. Like,
Yeah.
bring yourself back down. Like we're all doing something a little weird and getting a weird experience. Like puts it back into that kind of like perspective, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned the whole like ego thing
Mhm.
because that's actually a huge focus in Eastern mysticism.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that I started to become really interested in more esoteric topics was because I mean I had been meditating since I was a small child.
Hmm.
Um, like that was something that my mom did, so
Yeah.
I picked up on it. But I I went to college and I was really surrounding myself with philosophy, learning about philosophy. And while I meditated, I kind of had a really intense experience of like unity where I didn't have any sensation of like time or matter or thoughts or anything like that at all. And it caused me to really start studying uh, Hindu traditions very deeply because they talk about that as a kind of religious experience that a lot of their yogis would go through.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, I mean, it's not something that I've been able to reliably do over and over again. Like, I can get nice and relaxed and all
Hmm.
that pretty easily. But that's only happened maybe twice, I'd
Hmm.
say. Um, and I think that's really common
Yeah.
actually for people who even if they have extremely powerful experiences, that might only happen once or twice, but the practice is worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And something that I wanted to bring up just in relation to some of what you were saying before about the Force and how you can use that to more easily express concepts to people. I've been guilty of doing the same thing where if I'm trying to explain the concept of prana, then a lot of people have never heard of that. And the idea that breath is life and that life from the breath can connect you to everything around you just kind of confuses people sometimes if they're not used to that sort of Eastern mysticism. So when I get that look back, like, what are you talking about? I usually go, well, Star Wars, and that's
Mm.
it. Always turns into the Force at that point because the Force is just a concept that I feel like in the West we know better, but it kind of describes the same thing, I believe.
Yeah, and I mean, from the Eastern tradition, you've got this whole Taoist idea, which I think is pretty firmly connected to the same fundamental concept of the Force. And I mean, the Tao Te Ching opens with the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. So really, what does it matter what name I call what I'm talking
Hmm.
about?
Yeah. And sometimes when I try to talk about synchronicity, it because I can get this. So we talk about like synchronicity, energy. These terms are like loose terms to try to describe something that's kind of formless. And
Hmm.
so, I'll try to talk about like I felt an energy go through me. I saw these different synchronicities happen and at the same time felt this energy. If you replace that with I felt this force within and then received visions from the force or like it means the same thing. It's just we're using the pop culture reference to kind of bring it into a modern perspective, I think.
Yeah, and I think for like what we do at the temple, it's been really nice because it allows people to kind of have like I don't want to say like a lodge where they
Hmm.
have typical degrees, but it allows that kind of setting where you're able to talk to each other, and if you've been there a while and you know what you're talking about, that's represented in rank, and it gives a nice formal structure to use a really simplified terminology to go straight into bigger concepts.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. So let's get a little deeper into the Star Warsy side of this.
all right.
I know I'm assuming that since you're even though your practice is more like an Eastern meditation version of Star Wars, I would assume you're also a fan of Star Wars. Probably know a lot about extended universe and stuff like that. Uh,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
I just finished reading Tarkin. That
nice.
was great.
So there was a novel that I read that was about Darth Plagueis. It's Legends continuity now, but it was a really good book. And I don't know if you've read the Plagueis novel, but in it, the way the author describes their interactions with the Force, I was reading the book, and as a practitioner, I was like, he's describing magic. Like I don't know, it got me. There were a few different passages where I was like, this is like a poetic way to describe what it feels like to practice magic. And I was just kind of surprised that the author was keying into that in that book.
Oh yeah, and the dark side is
Hmm.
like, I mean, you have your whole right hand, left hand path thing,
Right.
but
Yeah.
that whole Sith thing where they use their anger and they use their passion and all that. I mean, there have been times when I'm doing my rituals, and that does help. I mean, if it does it for you, then getting really intensely pissed off about something can further your practice once in a while.
Hmm. Yeah, you're tapping into that primal side, which in the Star Wars universe is the dark side.
Yeah,
Hmm.
where in reality, what my whole approach is like there really shouldn't be so much of a distinction between a dark side and a light side, or a left hand path and a right hand path. There's just things happening, and
Right.
sometimes we're involved in them.
Yeah. And it's funny because the idea of a left-hand path and a right-hand path also originates from Eastern cultures, with Buddhist cultures back then. I can never remember the names of them for some reason, just because off the top of my head they don't come to me. But the idea like tantra and whatnot was what formed on the one end, and the other end was more about discipline and uh, staying within the kind of cloistered environment. And so that's where that origination of left hand and right hand comes from. And that's also where you get a lot of this idea of prana, breath, directly being a part of everything else. So you can see where George Lucas kind of took these concepts that people like Alan Watts was studying and explaining and put them into a movie form, put them into kind of a way people could grasp them easily.
Yeah, George Lucas actually was kind of a student of Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell wrote the Hero of Thousand Faces, and kind of codified the hero's journey that we refer to, where you go out and you have the self-doubt, and then you meet the wise man and get the magical tool, and eventually slay the dragon and get the prize.
Hmm.
Right. And
Yeah.
um, as part of the initiatory program that I went through in the temple, we had to consume some Joseph Campbell material, and his stuff is really interesting and comes from a really diverse set of mythologies that he's
Hmm.
studied firsthand. And it's kind of interesting. Double majored in college as a psychology student,
Nice.
and I got really into Carl Jung.
Yep.
And that same kind of thing pops up throughout Jung, whether it's in like Modern Man in Search of a
Hmm.
Soul, which is a great book, or The Red Book, or
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read Seven Sermons to the Dead.
No, I haven't read that one.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's like a Gnostic manifesto.
Nice. Yeah, and I mean, even his collective unconscious idea is similar to the Force in a way.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you can tap into that, and whatever symbolism
Hmm.
works for you. I've really been focusing on symbolism personally
Hmm.
in a broader sense. I'm really interested in theories of memetics,
Mm, yeah.
and yeah, because like a thumbs up, everybody knows what that means.
Right.
But that's also like a mudra
Right.
too. Yeah. And we have all of these things within our culture, which are basically tiny spells that
Hmm.
people cast in order to convey certain meanings without having to talk about it. Um, and it's kind of interesting, I think, to examine how similar those things have been throughout history,
Hmm.
um, not only in Western culture but in Eastern culture, and they have similar topics coming up in Mesoamerican religions. And I think personally that it points toward a kind of either ancestral religious system that they all come from,
Hmm.
or maybe perhaps a lot of them are having some really good ideas and having really
Yeah.
profound religious
I
experiences.
always thought it pointed to something about the human spirit because when Campbell is looking through all the stories, he's looking through stories that have existed for thousands of years in some cases, and he's finding the ones that not only were told time and time again, but then were eventually written down after that, which to me means that they had a real staying power. I mean, you start out with like 20 stories, and then only two of them make it to the next generation, and then there's 30 more, but those two keep going on, and for some reason, people love those two stories, and eventually they're the ones that are written down. And what you see is across cultures, it seems like the same type of stories had a staying power, which just shows something about how that relates directly with the human experience. And that's how I've always kind of looked at it. Whether they originate from an original culture or not, they still had to survive this test of time. And
Oh
that
yeah.
formula seems to be across all cultures. It's no different. So it says something about who we are as just humans.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and even how magic systems work,
Hmm.
like um, over the past few months, I've been looking into the Teutonic magic systems with the runes and all that fun stuff. I've got a very good book on it. It's called Teutonic Magic, actually.
Hmm.
Um, but what I found while looking over the rune stuff is that essentially the runes are just sigils. Um, and what someone's handing you when they hand you a book full of runes and saying, this rune has this effect, this rune has this effect, they're really just handing you a bunch of sigils that you can then program yourself to do those things.
Yeah, and then connect together to make bind runes and all kinds of cool stuff.
Yeah, and I think conceptually that that same thing applies to the whole mimetic
Hmm.
operation, where like if I play a little tune on a flute, like a folk tune, well, it operates the same way.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, a question that I got earlier, and I didn't want to interrupt the flow at the time, but it's moving off of my live chat screen, so I wanted to bring it up.
All right.
Brandon Carpenter says, "So, are you guys going to talk about force combat?"
So when it comes to like practical energy work,
Hmm.
Um, I have a little bit of experience. Or I in college I took Tai Chi and Qigong like
Yeah.
the whole time. So it basically I've been in martial arts and sometimes you can like tap into that like current and really go with the flow
Hmm.
and but beyond that, I mean, like shooting chi blasts or lightning, it might be possible. I don't want to discredit anyone who wants to go ahead and try to do that.
There's definitely a belief in it in some Eastern cultures that masters could get to that point within those practices. Now, I'm always hesitant to just say, yeah, that's possible just because they said it's possible. I haven't seen it for myself, but it is something in the lore of our own society, of our own history, as opposed to it's not just something from those movies. It's something based on that. Even the astral projection sort of combat that happened in the most recent Star Wars movie
Mhm.
is something that they've talked about before in Eastern traditions that masters were supposedly able to do.
Yeah, and I don't know what your out of body experiences have been like,
Mhm.
but mine have
Yeah, it's nowhere
not.
near that level.
Yeah, not only that, but reality like doesn't make sense
Yeah.
basically.
Yep.
So good luck.
Yeah, that's been mine too. So, to that, I would say the movies are, of course, going to be skewed somewhat. Luke trains with Yoda for, I don't know if it's a week or a month. It's hard to tell with the way that movie is put together, but then all of a sudden he's able to do a lot more than he could before, and training just doesn't happen that fast. But it's like any other movie. There's a montage, and they're better.
Well,
So there's a lot of movie tropes that happen there to bring the
right.
concepts into place, but that's just a movie being a movie. The
But the
core
important
concepts
thing
are
is
based on
that
something.
they establish thematically that he
Hmm.
trained. Uh,
Yes,
because ultimately, you say he trained for 6 months. What that breaks down to for most people is he trained.
right, exactly. He trained, and now he has this ability,
Yeah.
and it's just kind of showing the path there. But what movies do well is they recognize what we don't care to watch. It's like we're happy to say, okay, move past the training and let's see what happens next, because to an observer, the training is boring, even though to us in practice, training is actually really interesting.
Oh, yeah. And movies, I think, though they revolutionized visual media, obviously, but I think their potential really has barely been tapped at all. I mean, poetry and literature have, you know,
Oh yeah,
over 1,000 years to develop.
yeah,
Film's only been around for about 100 years, give or
yeah.
take. The things that we're going to be seeing in 50 years in theaters are going to blow our minds.
Yeah, and even if you compare it to plays, I mean, plays have evolved and changed so much over the years, and they have turned very different from what they once were. And the movie doesn't even kind of fall into that same structure as the
Well,
typical
no,
play.
well, no, because you can it's kind of cartoony, right? You can idealize every single aspect of what you're working with,
Right.
to the point where it's supposedly perfect.
Yeah. And that's why I
Um,
like to think of them kind of like mythology. Like, there's a school of thought that the old Greek myths and things like that weren't that the Greeks didn't believe them as a religion so much as use them as stories to kind of teach how to be or social concepts. In the same way that we would go and watch the new Avengers movie and then talk about it later about, oh man, it's cool, this character did that thing. We can keep this continuity of what happens in the movie separate from our reality with absolutely no problem. So it's funny that we assume that the ancient peoples didn't do the same thing with these stories. Now maybe I'm wrong, but some scholars are starting to believe that these stories were more like stories, like the way we view stories, but they
mhm.
just had a huge staying power. They were the Thors and Iron Men of their day.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if in a couple hundred years there were people with their altars to Thor and Iron Man. I mean, not Thor
But
like
Thor
Thor
has real
Thor.
sticking power now.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they just supercharged Odinism. That's why Asatru's been kicking off.
Yep.
Um, but I was gonna say that I lost my train of thought there. It happens from time to time.
Yeah, that's
Um,
okay.
Yeah, but I was going to say that it isn't like Jediism is the first
Right.
movie-based religion. Like Matrixism has been
Hmm.
around for a while
Dudism.
too. Dudism,
Can't forget
absolutely.
Dudism.
I am an ordained Dudist
Nice.
priest. Yeah, everybody should be. It only takes 2 minutes.
And speaking about the comparing martial arts training and combat to force usage and things, there's a guy on YouTube that I actually watch pretty regularly too. He's called Urban Acolyte. I don't know
I've
if you've
seen
ever.
his videos. Yeah.
Yeah, he started out as a real life Jedi kind of thing, where he was like, I'm going to teach people what these comparative things are, and then he got into theory, and his views shot up, and so now he's kind of one of the theorists. But he started out teaching people like, here's how I can't say it, Qigong techniques are similar to force maneuvers and force pushes and sensing the force and the flow of energy through you and stuff like that. It's really
Well,
interesting
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And even like I think at least once in my Qigong classes, they're talking about like pushing your hand forward and imagine it like you're doing a force push.
Yeah,
And it helps, honestly. And in some of your videos recently, you've been talking about like feeling energy
yeah,
more.
yeah. It's a new
Um,
new thing for me, but yes.
yes, that is actually almost exclusively what I do functionally.
Hmm.
Um, and honestly, it's pretty fun. Um, there are more strange uses than most people focus on. Like, I use kind of vibrations as a method of doing out of body stuff. So, like, when I sit down to meditate, and after about 5 minutes or so, I really feel my body flowing with one huge, strong, energetic vibration.
Hmm.
I use that to forget about my physical body and just go into an out of body experience. And I don't know if it's a side effect of how I do it or if it's how other people experience it, but I personally haven't ever seen like an astral body aspect of myself. Like I just kind of teleport around
Hmm.
where I intend to be or just like really quickly float
Yeah.
there, but it doesn't seem like I have arms or legs or anything.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's interesting about the whole. It hurts me even go into this, but the whole terminology of like astral projection, journeying, dreams, lucid dreams, all of that stuff. because I think a lot of us use different, we have different meanings for it. We've attached a meaning to one or two of those that is different from what other people use it for. And
Mm,
so I'm starting to pull away from even just saying like, this is what an astral travel is. This is what a lucid dream is. This is what a journey is. I kind of done that a little bit in the last few videos, and every time I bring up astral projection or travel, I get blowback from a ton of people. And I've had a video where I said it was similar to lucid dreaming, and people blew up at me that they're nothing alike. I've had videos where I've said they're absolutely unalike since I've had more experiences with them, and people blew up with me at me that they're exactly alike. And I'm like, all right, guys, I don't care. Like,
yeah,
I had an experience. I'm trying to describe the experience.
yeah.
But the reason that I have lately been saying they're different, I could be getting this wrong though, is that when I lucid dream or when I journey, I can see my limbs. And that's exactly what you were getting at. Like, I can
Mm,
see myself. I can even kind of, if I want to, sort of see myself as if I'm outside of myself, like see my body in the dream. But when
mhm,
I'm experiencing this thing that I'm calling astral projection, where it seems more vivid and real than anything else, I don't see myself. It's totally like 360 immersion into some place, is what it feels like. So, maybe someone else can answer me as to what that really is called, but that's what I'm talking about. It sounds like that's what you're talking about too.
yeah, and also when I'm in that state and kind of looking around at things, I don't feel like I'm actually seeing it. I feel like I'm seeing like kind of an ectoplasmic or aura shell where it's not quite solid, but it's not quite liquid or air. I
Yeah.
mean, it is hard to describe, which is probably why all of the
Yep.
discrepancies pop up in the first place.
Yeah. And I would also say that maybe we're seeing different degrees of it. Like maybe some of us are good at getting like deep into it, and then like I'm kind of a newbie to the whole astral travel thing. Even though I
Hmm.
do like sigil work and all this other magic stuff, astral has always been one of the things that like when it happens, it happens, and when it doesn't, it doesn't. I've never mastered that. So for me, maybe I'm seeing glimpses in, and other people that really are doing it are like, dude, you're not explaining it right. But there's no way for me to know that.
Yeah.
So I
And
just got to keep practicing.
also, I mean, I don't think it really matters so much ultimately because if you're meeting an entity in a
Hmm.
dream or in a journey or in an astral journey or whatever, then it's the same thing. You're still
Yeah.
getting the information.
Hmm. And that's the
I,
thing too is they'll talk to you. I believe in the masks theory now. I think that's Waylon had talked to me about it, and after that I've been like, whoa, this is it. That they are going to talk to you through a mask that you allow them to talk to you through, and so there is a degree that seems like it's coming from your mind, but that's just the form you're allowing them to inhabit, sort of, if that makes sense. And you can do that in
yeah,
a dream, you can do that in your imagination, you can do that in a journey, you can do that in an astral projection, you can do that wherever you want.
yeah, and I think that's why the Star Wars thing has been so useful to me
Hmm.
because now I can definitely have clear images in my head of these certain concepts, and however, like an entity of music might want to represent itself to me, maybe it'll come to me as Jerry Garcia or something.
Hmm.
Um, well, I have some reference to what that's going to be. And if I think beforehand, like the God of Wisdom is definitely Yoda, then
That's how he's going to look.
that's how he's going to look. And it gives me really just something to look for as a
Yeah.
kind of guide.
In my experience, what makes it unique, what really gives it the power where you're like, whoa, I'm not just imagining this, is what they say to you, what you learn from them. It isn't what they look like, because what they look like, I feel you're putting up there. But when they start to give you information, it's not the type of information that you yourself would have given. Because I've gone into these before, like I'm going to do an evocation, I'm going to ask this question, I'm pretty sure I already know the answer.
Hmm.
And that is not the answer I get. It's just like, no, you're wrong. here's a cryptic answer that's completely opposite of what you were thinking. Meditate on that. I'm like, great. And then from that, I'll get some real good results as I think on that more and more. I start to find whatever this path is I'm being shown. But it's just one of those things where I'm like, if it was me making it up, it would have just been like, yep, you're right. You're the smartest ever. I'm like, I know.
Yeah. And well, I think also that a lot of us don't necessarily think like linguistically,
Hmm.
where it's more like conceptual.
Yeah.
Like when I interact with entities, which is pretty rare, honestly, because I focus on more of a non-personal entity practice, but I do
Hmm.
occasionally. Actually, probably wouldn't have finished college if it weren't for Paimon.
Hmm.
So, uh, yeah, he's helpful.
Yeah, I
But
actually just had someone in the chat bring up Goetia a little bit ago asking, am I going to personally start working with Goetia again? That remains to be seen. It's not out of the realm of possibility, though.
yeah, and personally, actually, with the Goetia, I've found that I never really have those personal experiences. It's more like what I want to get done gets done pretty reliably.
Hmm.
Which I don't know, maybe that's just a consequence of using a system that I'm not entirely familiar with.
Hmm.
But um, yeah,
I was
it's
watching another YouTuber, and forgive me, I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about this concept of kind of punching a hole into the astral, where they were saying that when you work with goetic beings, you're kind of sending ideas to their place in the astral, allowing them to create it there, and then they are sending it back through a sort of boomerang effect. I thought that was a really interesting idea. I don't know if that's what's really going on with that. I haven't examined it at all. This was literally like a day or two ago that I was watching this video.
Mhm.
But I was thinking, man, that's a cool explanation of it, like a cool way of thinking about it. Because I do remember when I was working with the Goetia, it kind of felt like that. Like you were meeting at a crossroads point where the worlds are overlapping so that you could kind of hand off something you needed to have them do and then meeting again at some point and getting back results. So I think there might be some truth to that, but again, now we're talking about is the astral an actual place? Like what's going on?
Mhm.
It gets a little shaky at that point, but definitely a concept that I'm interested in investigating further.
Well, and it becomes tricky because within my view of the Force, I mean, ultimately, my view is that we're all indistinct from the Force.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
so theoretically, it shouldn't be any different working with certain entities,
Yep.
right? Because
Yeah.
there's still one with the Force, one with me, therefore I can do certain things.
Yeah, and that actually helps a lot because when I was earlier in my practice, I had this view that since I'm the grand infinity and the grand infinity is me, that means I'm already these other entities no matter what.
Mhm.
Whether it's psychological or not doesn't matter because I'm one with these entities no matter what because I'm one with everything. And therefore we're all brothers and sisters, so everything is like sunshine and rainbows basically was the way I was looking at it at the time. Not literally, but like, why not work with everything?
Well,
And
literally, yeah,
and
everything is sunshine and rainbows.
yeah. So I had that attitude at first, and man, I'll tell you, the evocations, the experiences I were having they were so vivid, they were so strong. And I've lost that since then because I've had some of the bad experiences that I've had where it's like, you know what, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. But that's just come from a couple of things. One being that, yeah, we might all be siblings in a sense, but siblings will still fight with each other. There's stories like Cain and Abel where the sibling kills each other. So like, just because that's the case doesn't mean you're safe. And then the other thing is I have a family, and so
Right.
there was a video I did way back where it was like I was doing a evocation invocation of Tiamat, where I was doing it to show everybody what that looks like.
Mhm.
And in it, there was a point where, I was being bold and saying, I don't fear death, which is true. And Tiamat laughed and said, "You will." And for a long time, I didn't know what that meant, but now I do. You see, I still don't fear my death. I've been past that fear of death for a long time, but I do fear what happens to my family if I die, what happens to my family if one of them dies. There's a fear now of death that's not a fear of my death, but a fear of how it will impact my son.
Well, I think it's a very Jedi thing too, because you know, attachment
Hmm.
is what leads to, fear.
Yep,
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate.
yep,
Hate. Yep.
yep.
There's Yoda's wisdom for you.
And my evocations and invocations, they still work from time to time. They will work with entities I've already worked with before who I already trust. But I'm having trouble now doing those evocations of other entities. Not that I haven't tried, but that there's something in the back of my mind that's keeping me from doing it now. It's like because of this concern, it's holding that back. And so
Well,
part of the reason I haven't dived back into the Goetia isn't because of a fear of it in the normal in the sense of like, oh no, it's a wrong thing to do. It's this weird fear of evoking something new into my life at the moment. And I haven't mastered it yet. It's a hard one.
I think also that as we continue to work with a single entity or a single system, we get more comfortable with that. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
well, and also that as we have like less and less new experiences from different sources, that also brings us more and more towards that entity that we're working with at that certain point in
Mm-hmm.
time.
Yeah.
So maybe I uh, I would say to avoid that would just be doing all of this stuff, but that might not be feasible.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's part of the journey. I really do believe that at some point I'll get past this and everything will go back to the way it was. As far as that ability will be in full bloom again. But I have other things now, like feeling energy and whatnot, that I couldn't do back then. That's kind of taken its place and taken an interest. So I haven't worked too hard at combating that fear, at building up the bravery necessary to overcome that and to accept it and embrace it and all of that. Because there's enough other interesting things going on that I've kind of shifted gears a little. I've become a little more mysticism as opposed to magic lately. That's
Hmm.
not a. Some people have asked me if that's a permanent transition. I don't believe it is. I believe it's that I'm rebuilding kind of a foundation level of things that I had skipped over when I was jumping so far ahead. Because being someone who was a self-proclaimed black magician originally, like you just want to keep pushing forward. You want to like it's not exactly like the dark side, but there's some dark side like concepts there. There's a lot of ambition in that side of it that
Well,
pushes you
it's
forward.
like the yin yang. There's always a little bit of dark in there with the light.
Yeah, exactly. So that ambition would be like, okay, I got this concept, next concept. I got this concept, next concept. And something I've learned over time is consciously you understand a concept way before you subconsciously in how do you say it embrace that concept. So,
Hmm.
like if you have someone like a death in the family, within everyone's sad, obviously, but within a few days, maybe even within moments of it happening, consciously you understand that they're gone and you understand that you have to be strong and all of that stuff happens. But that doesn't stop
Hmm.
grief and that doesn't stop the experience of it and that doesn't stop the feeling of loss or any of that other stuff. Consciously, you might beat yourself up for feeling those feelings, but it's you have to let your subconscious go through the process in order to actually get there where the conscious is. And that's how it seems to be with all this stuff. And so, if you're someone who's like, mastered that, mastered this, mastered this, mastered this, well, you've consciously understood each of these steps and you've experienced them. But did you really like sit in meditation for days on this concept? Did you spend months at a time on a single concept, actually letting your physical self kind of marinate in it? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
That
and
sort of thing makes
actually,
a difference.
that's kind of something that I do as part of my regular practice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, doing the whole Jedi thing, I meditate on the Jedi Code, which is really just five tenets. There is no emotion, there is peace,
Hmm.
there is no ignorance, there is knowledge, there is no passion, there is serenity, there is no chaos, there is harmony, there is no death, there is the Force.
Hmm.
And I find that as I meditate on each of those aphorisms every day, well, some days maybe most of that stuff isn't going to come through to me, but some days
Some
just
days
one
that's
of
big.
those messages is
Yeah.
going to be very important. And I feel like that's why also the whole practice of a mantra
Hmm.
became very popular. Like I've read the uh, the tantras
Hmm.
or in all the Yoga Sutra stuff, and these mantras usually translate to something like, "Oh, great Buddha, let me be enlightened too,"
Hmm.
and really, there's no difference between the two things.
Right.
Like they're just ideals that they're trying to focus on in their meditation. But I feel that having like a relatively short code that's easy to memorize makes it so that it's more of a Swiss Army knife. Like it
Hmm.
becomes
Yeah.
useful as I need it to.
Yeah. And you can be moving through your day, have something happen, and have that piece that's relevant to the moment come to mind.
Yeah.
Because that's how all affirmations work. That's one of the reasons when people come to me in private messages and ask me how to fix like a pre-programmed thought or a fear, get over a fear or a way that they're thinking about themselves, I almost always go to affirmations first. I go to sigil magic to get big things done, but I go to affirmations for almost everything else because people don't like it because it just sounds like normal self-help stuff. Like say this thing to yourself every day for the next month in the mirror every morning until it feels like it's actually happening each day, and then go about your day. But I swear to you, whatever situation has been bothering you will come up within 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, somewhere in that period. It will come up, and instead of having whatever normal reaction you had, whatever that pattern was, that thing you've been saying each day will come right into your mind. It'll be the first thought in the front door. And that's what's amazing about it. So instead of having the negative come up first and having to rethink about it and get what you really believe, it's the first one out there. You've made it a habit to think of that. And it's just it works real wonders with not having to fight off a negative attitude especially.
Yeah, and I think that being really prideful is one of those things
Hmm.
that prevents people from doing like affirmations. I have a friend who I tried to show him an affirmation thing once, and he's like, "This is a person calmly telling me to repeat what they're saying. No, I reject it entirely, immediately." Um, and I mean, that's just kind of what you're going to run into with a
Yeah,
lot of people because it does kind of sound silly
right.
if you're looking at it from an outside perspective, but it does work. I mean, it certainly worked for me.
Hmm.
So I would be willing to tell other people that
Yeah.
it
And
works.
if you have a mantra from any movie, if it strikes a chord with you as like that's what I need in my life, there's no reason you can't make it or an adaptation of it into your mantra. Like the Dune mantra of I must not fear, fear is the mind killer. Like
Hmm.
that can help people to overcome fear.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, as long as I think there are certain like triggering words, like even breaking it down to something like fear.
Hmm.
You repeat fear over and over again, and you kind of embody
Yeah.
that. Your palms get sweaty, like you feel the physical effects. And one of the videos that I have on my channel talks about doing this with emotions. Is you try your best in your meditation to feel the emotion as much as you physically
Yeah.
can,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
uh, and then analyze it as much as you can. And then when it pops up, well, you already know everything about it.
Yeah. That's right. That took me a long time to understand myself as well. The that processing your emotion is what has to happen. that rejecting it is going to make it bottle up, but allowing it is how you overcome it.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah,
counterintuitive, I think, with the way that we're raised in the West, to think like allow something in order to get past it, as opposed to fight, which is what we're you kind of used to.
yeah. And when I was a teenager, I met a Buddhist monk, not one of the more tantra ones, one of the more like grounded, really like focus heavy, focus on not focusing.
Hmm.
Um, but I asked him because I was a depressed teen. I was like, well, what am I supposed to do about my depression? It makes it really difficult for me to meditate sometimes.
Hmm.
And they told me, well, you can't get rid of it. You got to be friends with it.
Yep, that's right.
Uh, and I didn't understand it for a long time.
Hmm.
But it is important and it can help.
And one of the reasons too, sometimes I'll talk about this thing and I'll say people hate this. Like people hate being told to meditate. People hate being told to do affirmations and stuff like that. Uh, I'm partially projecting when I say that because I'm remembering when I first was told to do this years ago. And my
Hmm.
reaction to it was like, that doesn't sound fun. I'm going to do sigil magic. Like,
Yeah.
so I'm not necessarily the actual scholar on whether people actually do believe these things are boring. I'm thinking back to when I first got into magic and was like, yeah, I know meditation's important and all, but yeah, I know affirmations sound great, but I'm going to do this other crazy stuff. And, you eventually learn that those fundamental things are way more important and work much stronger than the crazy stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that was one thing that was really stressed on us in the martial arts is
Hmm.
do your fundamentals
Yeah,
every single day. Because ultimately, you're probably not in most situations gonna do like triple flip, like tornado kick
yeah,
type thing. But if you get really good at throwing a roundhouse kick, well, that's much better.
yeah,
Um, and it's the same thing for the occult. Like when I'm not regularly meditating, and sometimes I'm not regularly meditating, and it's horrible. I don't know why I do that.
yeah, yeah. I have that same thing. I'll have a couple days where it's like, oh, I don't have time. Of course you do. You always do, but you decided not to for some reason. I don't know why we do this, but we do it to ourselves. And
Yeah,
then
and then
when you
you
go
do
back
it.
to it after a day or two, you're like, why did I stop doing this? It feels so good.
Yeah. But when I'm not meditating for a day or two, like even feeling that same like vibration is gonna be really difficult for me. Depending on how often I meditate, getting to a full-bodied vibrational state might range anywhere from 30 seconds to over an hour. Um, so doing it really frequently does help by a lot. And you do lose it, like
Yeah,
if you don't use it.
yeah. That's why lately I've been using metaphor of working out, doing exercise, because a lot of people understand that metaphor that it's kind of like working a muscle. If you start skipping the gym too often, you got to start over from scratch. So, because people will ask me sometimes, they'll, especially if they're doing Golden Dawn or something like that, where they have these daily, sometimes multi-time a day things that you need to do. And they'll say,
Mhm,
I missed a day. Am I screwed? And I'm like, no, 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 you're cool. Because it's like the gym. You miss one day of the gym, it's really not a big deal. If you miss one day of the gym and then another day and then another day because you've decided to start slacking, it is a big deal. So,
mhm,
you kind of have to gauge it yourself.
mhm,
It isn't. I think they're looking for kind of a divine karma view because they're new, and
mhm.
that's kind of how we think at first. It's like, oh man, is there like some kind of punishment for me not doing it every day? No, 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 there's not a punishment. There's a repercussion for not doing it every day.
Well, in some Buddhist, like more esoteric Buddhist stuff, you have like the mantra of light,
Hmm.
where you take sand and you chant this mantra over it 100,000 times. And then if you sprinkle on someone, living or dead, they will gain liberation from the circle of reincarnation.
Nice.
Um, but what I think it really is like, okay, we got to make sure that these people are doing this constantly so that their magic batteries don't drain out too quickly.
Hmm.
So yeah, 100,000 times seems like a good number.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Um, so I had someone ask earlier, and I keep saying someone because these are scrolling by me. I'm using the wrong hand over here in my video. These are
Oh,
scrolling. There we go, scrolling by me really fast, and I'm reading some of them, but and some of them I'm remembering to bring up. But somebody asked me about psychic vampirism, which I actually think is relevant to this conversation because if we're gonna go into like KOTOR style Star Wars background, we've got characters like Darth Nihilus, uh,
force drain.
yeah, who can do basically psychic vampirism on a gigantic scale. But where do you fall on the concept of psychic vampirism? Have you run into anybody who's talked about it before? Have you thought about it with qigong and things like that? The idea of draining energy from someone else. Do you believe that is something that's possible? And if so, in what way?
Well, I'd say not only that it's possible, but that people are doing it constantly.
Hmm.
Um, that it's not like we're just solid bodies that exist independently of each other. Even if you want to take an atomic theory perspective, we're constantly radiating atoms.
Right.
Molecules are flying all over the place. Uh, and just like in trade, some people need a little more of something. Some people have that
Yeah.
but need less of it. And it usually works like that. When you have psychic vampirism unwillingly, it's usually that someone's not in a good mental state, and what they're requiring from others literally is taking more energy consumption.
Yeah.
Uh, but willing psychic vampirism, I mean, when I was a young kid playing with the occult,
Hmm.
I would mess around with psychic vampirism, especially doing like the energy work that
Hmm.
I've been doing, and I would notice that over time, if I was doing it to someone, they would feel tired or get angry more easily,
Hmm.
and if it would also make me feel like more refreshed.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I kind of use that same psychology, like physically of how it works, thinking about it. It's like I'm taking energy from this person.
Hmm.
I used that same kind of method to kind of get into more energy healing, and I don't claim to be some great energy healer who can like heal diseases, but I mean, once in a while, I've had like a cut or some swelling from like accidentally punching something where I've been able to essentially heal myself.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've looked into Reiki and basically, I mean, it's the same theory.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, I didn't have any accreditation. Like, I know some Reiki places now do these master's degrees, and they're like, "Hey, give us $10,000 and you can have a Reiki master's certificate."
Yeah. Right.
Um, yeah, like that's great. I'll get back to you once I have $10,000 to spend whenever I please. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, there was actually a Zen group nearby me that they lost their practice space because they were running entirely on donations.
Mm,
So, I mean, I can see how requiring some compensation for some things might be reasonable, but
right.
I don't think that 10,000 bucks
Mhm.
is very fair.
Yeah, and I played with the concept of psychic vampirism when I was early into the occult. Now, I haven't tried it since getting deep in, uh, at least not in the ways that would be attacking people or anything like that. Uh, but what I have noticed is if I'm out at a club or something like that, and before I even say this, I am not a great dancer. We're just going to throw that up there. So, when that happens, I'm just going to be out there looking like a fool on the dance floor because that's just what I do. But if I go out there and I'm dancing in a group of people that are dancing, then I can dance all night.
Well, it's very Dionysian.
Right. And if I go out there and there's nobody else out there, I get tired. So
Yeah.
there's obviously some kind of shared energy or residual energy or something that is going through that crowd.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's connected to like empathy,
Hmm.
where you'll see the same thing on like roller coasters. Like even if you're normally a stone-faced person, if you go on a roller coaster and everyone's screaming all around you, you might join in.
Yeah.
Um, and those are reflected in some pretty nice photos usually by the end of the ride. Uh,
I got a comment that says, "Bullshit, Joe. I bet you can dance like Presley."
I'd pay to see it.
I'll do the pelvis. Man, but honestly though, it isn't just like excitement because there's always the excitement of a crowd. Like obviously, if you go to a concert and a crowd is worked up, the whole concert feels better. And that's not exactly what I'm talking about. It's I can have energy longer, it feels like, and then the next morning I feel fine. I'm not exhausted from it. I have a little bit of muscle pain like what you'd expect, but I don't have like crazy muscle pain. And but if I'm trying to just dance by myself or something, even if I'm trying to raise energy by dancing in my office, I have a limited store, it seems like, by myself. But in a group, for some reason, like in a group that's all into it, it's almost like effortless. It's like I'm not using my own energy, is what it feels like.
Well, if you want to see an example of like that real kind of Dionysian spirit and psychic vampirism in practice,
Hmm.
just go to a metal show. There are mosh pits where people are injuring themselves in such a way where they shouldn't be walking around,
Yeah,
especially given how inebriated they usually are. But they still can just ride the wave.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, actually, the I think concerts are a usually pretty untapped source of magic potential. Like
Hmm.
you can, when you've got a crowd as a musician, where you can control their emotions based on like what positions your hands are in on an instrument,
Hmm.
like that's some pretty powerful magic on its own.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I've noticed a lot of musicians have what seems to me to be a tie in to these occult concepts really easily, that ideas like trance state and things are just natural to them. They don't, you explain it to them once, they're like, oh yeah, I do that. I got that. Or like channeling ideas and concepts is natural. A lot of things that we have to train to do, it seems like someone who's musically inclined picks up really quick.
Oh, trust me, the I took 10 years of guitar lessons. The musically inclined people do have to train to do it.
Oh yeah,
Um,
but I mean they before they're if they do that and not the occult, then later when they come into the occult, they're like, oh, I got these skills, but
well, because they're doing the same thing,
yeah.
right? They're messing with empathy, they're messing with vibrations, they're messing with individual conscious epistemology, basically.
Hmm.
I mean, and they're doing it in such a way where it's very they grok it like instead of just understanding it, it's very visceral, like it's part of what they do.
Hmm.
um, and that's actually part of what I've been doing is I've been playing around. I've got these bamboo flutes sitting around, and I'll toot away on them and kind of program basically sound sigils, where I'm like, I want to access this state of trance really quickly. So I just toot on the flute, and within a couple repetitions, I'm there instead of having to do like 20 minutes sitting in meditation preparing for it.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, there's just so much potential, and so many musicians do it without even realizing it, like drum circles,
Yeah.
even. Uh,
Sometimes too, if I'm having a day where my mind, I have too many thoughts going through my mind, I can't, you gotta quiet it to get into your meditative state. But sometimes if I'm in that moment and I just have too much going on, I'll just take a moment to listen to a song and then come back and quiet my mind afterward. And that seems like, because it pulls you out of whatever you were thinking about. You get pulled into that music, and then you can go back and just clear out whatever's left. So sometimes music seems like a good way to transition into doing these types of things as well.
yeah, and I think like what I've been focusing on a lot lately is a lot of spiritual practices will have music as part of their thing. Like they'll do the little ding with the bowl or
Hmm.
whatever at the beginning of their practice, or they'll have specific hymns that they do throughout the practice. What I'm trying to do with my own practice over the last few weeks, at least, has been doing an entirely music based system um, where I'm kind of trying to apply like the theory of the chaos magic stuff that I've studied and all that to like a single action that I'm doing over and over again, or a set, or even like a single phrase of music. And one of my projects that I'm working on with my flute is I'll have a single breath as a single line,
Hmm.
and so like however many notes I play on that, and I'll kind of infuse that line as a sigil, and then I'll do a whole bunch of other ones, and then combine them into a single musical piece that serves as kind of like a hyper sigil, which I think it'd be neat if we got a whole bunch of occult musicians doing that,
Hmm.
because already, I mean, sound itself is it's a meme, right? I mean, words are just
Right.
memes that we can say to each other, and so each note fundamentally is going to bring about a certain feeling in someone, and combinations of notes even more so. But actually committing conscious effort to saying, I want this series of notes
Hmm.
to be this.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
kind of the same practice.
yeah,
It's like sigil
I
creation.
I feel like it's almost and like with drawn sigils and even like mandalas and
Hmm.
that too. I feel like that's almost itself a form of manifestation,
Right. Yeah.
where yeah, you're bringing your will physically manifest
Hmm.
into the world, and it might just be a sound or a symbol, but it's there.
So let's talk a little bit about your channel. I know that I've watched the videos on your channel. I know that you have some meditation videos. I think you've even talked about this topic before with music, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that was one of my recent ones. I don't upload very often because honestly, when I do upload things, it's either because I've just done a bunch of research on
Hmm.
something that I'm going to put into practice, or I've been practicing something really diligently, so I'm feel capable of covering one topic. And for
Right.
me, that entails like months of focusing on one or two things or one or two concepts, even at times, and then simplifying it in such a way where I can present it to other people. And that's kind of the purpose of my channel, is writing out these video essays where if I were to describe what this does to someone, uh, and why it does that, then this is how I would do it. And really figuring out how I would apply those explanations if people were to ask me.
Hmm.
Uh, and I do see it as kind of like a grimoire. And I think actually that these occult YouTube channels are going to be some of the most valuable grimoires that are left to the next generation because you get to, in real time, now see dozens and dozens of experienced and dedicated occultists who are going through their whole journey, and you get to see it in real time, basically.
Yeah. And your channel is Force Mysticism. I
Yes.
have it. It's in the descriptions below. I've got a link to that. Is there anything else that you'd like to promote aside from the channel?
World peace.
Good answer. A very
Uh,
Jedi answer.
yes. Uh, well, gotta get that world peace. It's important. We'll get there eventually.
Well, we'll see. There's another alternate. Well, I guess it will be peaceful either way. However it works.
Whether humans are involved in the equation.
Oh man, yep. That appealed to my morbid sense of humor.
Oh, well, I think that a lot of people in the occult, uh, either they have to have a really morbid sense of humor, or
Hmm.
they have to be really, really like new agey, like love is all there is.
Yeah,
Um, because I mean, you're messing with concepts like this,
yeah,
so
yeah.
you,
Well, I'd like to thank you for coming on. We should talk more in the future. Any last thing you want to leave the audience with?
oh no, that's good. May the force be with you all.
Awesome. And until next time, safe travels.